Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Beyond Slavery's Shadow with Warren Milteer Jr. My name is Tanya Day, and I'm the site manager at the Orange County Historical Museum. A quick reminder, we are recording this program, so if you could please keep your microphones and your videos off throughout the presentation, that would be really helpful. We are also advising you to put your screen on active speaker view. That's going to help you focus a little bit more on the presenter. We are hoping to have time for questions at the end, so feel free to put them into the chat box at that time. We are also delighted to be co-hosting this event with the Alliance for Historic Hillsborough and the Burwell School. So I will let on the representative from the Alliance at this time, and she'll introduce herself and talk a little bit more about our presenter tonight, Warren Milteer Jr.
Hi, I'm Annie Newton. I just wanted, on behalf of the Alliance for Historic Hillsborough, I just wanted to thank you all for joining us tonight. I'd like to say thank you to Warren Milteer for doing this wonderful program. I'm the program coordinator at the Alliance. And just a reminder to everyone, this evening, if you would like to purchase Dr. Milteer's book, we do have them for sale at the Visitor Center. You can come by in person in Hillsborough and purchase them, or we will have them for sale starting tomorrow on our website. So again, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We are delighted to be partnering with both the Burwell School and the museum for this just wonderful program. And thank you, Dr. Milteer, for joining us this evening.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda. I hope you can hear me. My video is not wanting to start, of course, because that is how technology works. But I'm the site coordinator for the Burwell School, and I'm just excited to be co-hosting this event with everyone, and delighted to be here this evening and hear our speakers. So I hope everyone enjoys.
Excellent. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Annie. We'd also like to acknowledge, pardon, that this program is made possible with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, North Carolina Humanities, and the Town of Hillsborough Tourism Board. And so tonight, as we've said, we are honored to feature Warren Milteer Jr. for Beyond Slavery's Shadow to examine the lives of free people of color in North Carolina. Milteer received his PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2014. His publications include 2 academic books, Beyond Slavery's Shadow, Free People of Color in the South with UNC Press, and North Carolina's Free People of Color, 1715 to 1885. The independently published Hertford County, North Carolina's Free People of Color and Their Descendants, as well as articles in the Journal of Social History and the North Carolina Historical Review. Milteer was the recipient of the Historical Society of North Carolina's R.D.W. Connor Award in 2014 and again in 2016 for the best journal article in the North Carolina Historical Review. So thank you so much again for joining us tonight. And now we will turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you all for having me and giving me the opportunity to discuss my work about free people of color. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see here. Everybody can see that with no problem. So what I want to do today is focus primarily on North Carolina and the study of free people my study of free people of color in this particular state. But I'll go back and mention a couple of details about other parts of the South. And if anybody has questions about other parts of the South, feel free to ask those at the end of the presentation. So what I want to do to begin is read just a little bit from my book, North Carolina's Free People of Color, 1715 to 1885, to help us get into a little bit of a discussion about my main objectives in my research about North Carolina's Free People of Color. So in the introduction of the book, I write, in 1902, not long after the publication of a series of now famed works that included The Conjure Woman and Other Conjure Tales and The Wife of His Youth and Other Stories of the Color Line, Charles Waddell Chestnut sat down to pen a lesser known article titled The quote, Free Colored People of North Carolina for Hampton Institute's Southern Workmen. Born to parents who were free persons of color before the Civil War, Chestnut used his intimate knowledge of the population of his study, along with other sources, to describe the social position and ancestral origins of the, quote, free colored people. He wrote that, quote, the status of these people prior to the Civil War was anomalous but tenable. In describing their origins, Chestnut mentioned mixtures between, quote, Negroes, whites, and Indians. He argued that many free people of color, quote, perhaps most of them, were, as we have seen, persons of mixed blood. A careful search through court records, censuses, vital records, church records, wills, deeds, newspapers, pension files, and oral histories confirms a picture of life for free people of color remarkably similar to the one described by Chestnut more than a century ago. And so this is an image of Charles Chestnut, who wrote about free people of color in the early 1900s. And so I began my book about North Carolina's free people of color with this passage in order to highlight two of the major issues that I deal with in the book. And so one is about the status of free people of color. So I'm looking at both their legal status and how they're treated under the law and how politicians look at them, but also their experiences in everyday life in North Carolina from the colonial period through the Civil War into Reconstruction. And so I was interested in learning about their status, in particular because I had read other studies about free people of color, including about free people of color in North Carolina, and thought that I could bring something to the conversation about the particular place of free people of color in the state. The second part of my book, or at least the second major goal of my book, was to look at the origins of free people of color in North Carolina, to understand how did they become free, and to also get a sense of their ancestry. Who are these people? Are they people who are of African descent? Are they people of Native American descent? To what degree are they of these backgrounds? So that was something that I tried to investigate. And in doing that, I tried to examine racial categories that were used in the 1700s and 1800s, such as Negro or mulatto or person of color, and examine exactly what did those ideas or words mean in the context of the 1700s and 1800s. Now, as mentioned, I've written 3 books about free people of color, so I just wanted to make sure that we had that clear. So my first publication was Hertford County, North Carolina's Free People of Color and Their Descendants. And that book was published in 2016. I self-published that book. It's a local history about a community of free people of color and those people who came after them. So it's roughly covering from the periods the mid 1700s into the mid 20th century. I followed up that book with North Carolina's Free People of Color, 1715 to 1885, which is what I'll primarily discuss today. And that book came out in 2020 with LSU Press. And then most recently, I've published Beyond Slavery's Shadow, Free People of Color in the South, which came out with UNC Press at the end of last year. And that is the book that I signed copies of and that the Visitor Center has copies of. So I definitely encourage you to get a copy if you're interested. And so you may wonder why if I decided to write all these books about free people of color. And so first of all, this comes out of my academic interests, but also I became interested in the topic of free people of color because of my own family connections to the topic. So I have numerous ancestors who were free people of color in the period before the end of slavery in the United States. And so learning about them at an early age and investigating their lives encouraged me to look deeper into the experiences of free people of color as I began to make connections between the people that I was connected to and other communities of free people of color. I should also mention, before I delve further into the presentation, that when we're talking about free people of color, we're talking about people who could be of African and or Native American descent primarily. So many people assume when they're looking at this term free people of color that they're solely looking at people of African descent, but it does seem that some people who had Native American ancestry and maybe not, and may not have had any African ancestry were also lumped into the category of free people of color, especially those Native people who weren't associated with Native nations that were recognized, say, by the state government or colonial government. So I'm thinking in the case of North Carolina, the Cherokees, generally people who were Cherokee were not categorized as free people of color because they were able to maintain nation-to-nation relationships with the United States and also had relationships with the state government of North Carolina operating as a sovereign entity. Now, just to give you a sense of where North Carolina fits within the larger story of free people of color, I provided you with this chart that shows the populations of the different southern states when it comes to free people of color in 1860. And so you can see that North Carolina by 1860 has the third largest population of free people of color. And that's where North Carolina tends to be throughout the period in which I examined. So sometimes Delaware has a few more free people of color than North Carolina, but generally North Carolina is ahead of Delaware, behind Virginia and Maryland. And so you can see North Carolina may not have the largest population of free people of color, but it definitely has a significant population of free people of color. And although a lot of people don't associate North Carolina with the topic of free people of color, North Carolina's free people of color are an important part of the larger population of free people of color in the South. Actually over 10% of the population of free people of color by 1860. So in the South, there are slightly more than 250,000 free people of color in the region. And there are more free people of color in the South than you would find in the North by several thousand. this is just a visual representation of those numbers so that you can get a sense of the populations and where they're located. So North Carolina is the orange section of the pie, and then Maryland is the light blue section, Virginia is the light green section, and all of the other southern states make up the smaller sections of the pie. And so you can see that Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina alone make up well more than half of the population of free people of color in the South by 1860. This chart provides you just a more micro look at the locations where free people of color are as far as counties or other similar jurisdictions. And so you can see in this chart, again, that the majority of free people of color in the South are situated in the Upper South, with the exception of Orleans Parish, which is where New Orleans is located, and Charleston District, where the city of Charleston is located. Now, to hone in to North Carolina specifically, here are the 7 counties that in 1860 had more than 1,000 free people of color. So you can see that all of them are outside of that top 15, but nevertheless, these counties have significant populations of free people of color, and most of them would be in the top 50 or so counties in the South when it comes to populations of free people of color. And I think Halifax County is probably even in the top 25 to 30 locations when it comes to populations of free people of color by 1860. And if you go back before 1860, some of the other counties may have been a little bit higher on the list. I think Craven County at one time had the largest population of free people of color, but that number wavered over time. Now, what I want to do for the rest of the time is to just go through a few stories about free people of color, mention a few individuals that might be of interest. And in doing that, I'll try to highlight the overall structure of my book on North Carolina's free people of color and some of the issues that I look at in North Carolina's free people of color. And I should say that a few of these individuals also appear in Beyond Slavery Shadow, Free People of Color in the South. So in the first chapter of my book, I primarily focus on the question of the origins of free people of color and the construction of this idea of free people of color, the category. And so in doing that, I look at the ancestral backgrounds of free people of color as far as we can figure out, showing examples, say, of Native American people who end up being classified as free people of color, as well as people who are assumed to have quote unquote Negro ancestry, because that's the kind of terminology they're using. They're not always saying somebody's of African ancestry. They're using the term Negro, which we can sometimes assume means African, but not necessarily all the time. But I'm looking at that and how these race terms are being constructed. And I'm also looking at the idea of freedom and how free people of color obtain freedom, document their freedom. And so in doing that, I discuss free people of color who obtain their freedom as a result of their free ancestry. So if your mother's free, you're supposed to be free under North Carolina law. And so there are many free people of color who are either descendants of Native American women, or they're descendants of white women, or in some cases, such as that of Mary Dove, there are people who claim their freedom as a result of being lineal descendants of women from the East Indies, which would include modern day India and other parts of Asia. And so Mary Dove, in her particular case, claims descent from an East Indian woman. That's the terminology that we would have used at the time. In order to claim her freedom, she's illegally being held in bondage, and several of her relatives are also being illegally held in bondage. And they are able to prove through at least one statement of somebody who claims to have known their ancestor that indeed they were people of East Indian descent and therefore should be free people. So the Dove family of Craven County comes from this origin. Following my discussion of the ancestral backgrounds and routes to freedom for free people of color, I look at the class divide amongst free people of color in the colonial period, both in the way that free people of color are discriminated against in the law, as well as in their daily lives. So in my discussion of the law, I show how free women of color, poor free people of color tend to be targeted in North Carolina laws for discrimination versus certain free people of color who may be more well-to-do. So as a result, poor women of color, those who are in the servant class, tend to have some of the most difficult interactions in the colonial period as a result of these discriminatory laws and the overall poor treatment of people of the lower classes, or people who are situated in relationships in which they have less power. Now, on the opposite side of that are free people of color, like William Chavis of Granville County. So William Chavis of Granville County was a property owner, as far as he owned real estate property. And the image that you see on the PowerPoint is from a deed in which he's purchasing land. But William Chavis's wealth went beyond simply land. He was also a slaveholder and enslaved at least a dozen people at one point in his life. He also managed a tavern. He was literate. So his experience contrasted significantly from those people who were in the servant situation, in the servant class, during the same colonial time period. And some of the laws that discriminated against, say, poor servant women wouldn't have applied to him because he wasn't a woman and he wasn't a poor person. And so in a certain way, he is privileged, although there are a few laws that would apply to him that discriminated against him, such as there's a testimony law in North Carolina that comes about in the late colonial period that doesn't allow free people of color to testify against white people in court. So that would have been something that he would have had to deal with. But the rules that entrapped many servant free people of color and generations of servitude wouldn't have affected him. And in some sense, had he kept service of his own, may have benefited him. Now, in the third chapter of my book, I move on to the post-colonial period, looking at what's going on in early national North Carolina when it comes to debates about free people of color. So by the time we get into the national period, we see a shift in the way that laws affect the lives of free people of color. There's a greater push from certain politicians who are, I would describe as pro-slavery politicians, especially those who are extremists in that bloc, as well as white supremacist politicians, to not just attack certain segments of free people of color, but to start applying laws more broadly to the population of free people of color in North Carolina. And so they're attacking all types of privileges and rights of free people of color, from their ability to be protected from the testimony of enslaved people, which was actually an issue of the time. It wasn't clear whether enslaved people would have the right to testify against free people of color. They could not testify against white people. And there was laws that were, a law later passed to clarify that indeed allowed enslaved people to testify against free people of color, basically putting them in an equal footing in court with enslaved people, which they saw as very problematic. In North Carolina, free men of color could vote until 1835, when they lose the right to vote during a constitutional convention to change the North Carolina Constitution. And this particular slide is related to that. So Jesse Speight was one of the members of the convention who voted to disfranchise free people of color. And he, like many people during the convention, used rhetoric that tried to state that free people of color didn't have the capacity to vote, as far as they weren't necessarily fit, quote unquote, to vote. Other people argue that it was bad for free people of color to vote because it was a poor influence on the enslaved population. Other people made just very clear white supremacist arguments, stating that free people of color shouldn't have rights that should be reserved for white people. But in this particular snippet, in an article that was published after the disfranchisement, we get a sense at least why Speight and probably other members of the convention voted to discriminate against free men of color and take away their right to vote. And ultimately, he says, deduct the free Negro votes, and it was no contest at all. It was known nearly all of them voted against me. So he's actually supporting this, not so much because he's primarily interested in upholding white supremacy, or for the sake of upholding white supremacy, or for pro-slavery reasons, but ultimately it has to do with his political future. He sees these people as preventing him from maintaining power, or potentially preventing him from maintaining power, and so he votes to disfranchise them for that reason. And so that's one thing that I try to get at when I'm examining these laws throughout the book, and also in my other book, Beyond Slavery's Shadow, is to get deeper into the reasoning behind discriminatory laws and why they're passed. It's not purely out of animus for free people of color that these laws are passed, but they're strategic. The politicians who advocate for them are advocating for them because it does something for them politically, or for their constituents when it comes to their economic situation. And just to build on that, moving away from voting rights, another issue that I discuss is a law that was passed preventing free people of color from selling liquor. And so that law, when it was passed, was supported by people who made claims similar to those made by the people who supported disfranchisement. And that was, oh, well, free people of color may corrupt our slaves. They may sell liquor to our slaves and get our slaves drunk. And therefore, we don't need free people of color selling liquor. That's the type of argument they make. But if you look deeper into who the supporters were of the restrictions on sales for liquor, it's actually white people who sell liquor. So they're trying to eliminate their economic competition by supporting legislation to curb the rights of free people of color. And I say this not to say that there isn't any just pure animus behind some of this, but there are also other connections to the discriminatory regime that develops in North Carolina beyond simply, oh, I don't like free people of color because they're persons of color. Now, moving on from the discussion about the debate around the place of free people of color from legislators and others who were involved in lawmaking in the state, I discussed the place of free people of color in everyday society in post-colonial or early national North Carolina. And so in that section of my work, I look at the day-to-day interactions of free people of color and white people and how they both help each other, but also sometimes harm each other. And I also focus on the economic contributions of free people of color in North Carolina. And so many free people of color are contributing to the state's economy through their labor and through their businesses. And so one of the people who creates an important business in North Carolina is Thomas Day. And so Thomas Day had a cabinet making workshop in Milton, North Carolina. And as you can see from the image, the building is still standing in Milton, and you can drive to Milton and view the building. And I think you can even still go inside if you can make contact with somebody to open it up for you. But anyways, the building is located near Danville, Virginia. And Thomas Day, because he was located in this border region between North Carolina and Virginia, he was able to conduct business in both states. He gained quite a reputation in the region at large. He actually did some work for the University of North Carolina. So he was well connected and was able to also contribute to his community through his work. He's creating jobs. In a sense, he has many people working in his workshop, including white journeymen, free people of color, and enslaved people. Following my discussion of the general interactions between free people of color and their larger community, I focus in the next section of the book on the families of free people of color and looking closer at their family life, or the diversity of family life that could be found amongst free people of color. And this is a topic that I found to be a bit understudied and often misunderstood by scholars who have looked at free people of color in the past. And so what I do is I look at and explain the different ways that free people of color built families. And so one way that we see free people of color building families is with one another. So there are communities in which large numbers of free people of color stick to themselves, create connections with one another, often that go on for generations. So we'll see families that are tied together from the colonial period, even to this day in certain cases, where you might have siblings from one family marry siblings of another family, and then in the next generation, they are intermixing with maybe another family that is next door, and they just keep that pattern going and going over time. And so one of the communities where I noticed this pattern was Hertford County, North Carolina, which is a place that I've studied quite a bit. And Willis and Sally Jones, whose pictures I have here, are representative of one of those families of free people of color that interacted heavily from the colonial period into the modern time. And so what you see is that the Weaver family and some other families continuously intermarry and stick together as far as their larger social group. Um, Now, beyond free people of color just sticking to themselves, you also do have free people of color who join in family relations with white people, and many free people of color somewhere down the line have some ancestor who was classified as white. Also, you have free people of color who interact with the enslaved population. So they're free people of color who may have a spouse or children or other relatives who are enslaved. And so the line between enslaved people and free people of color can be very blurry in those situations. And to add more complication to all of these scenarios, you have the issue of class playing an important role in these divisions. And I see that in particular with some of the formerly enslaved people who become free people of color. They often are divided based on class lines. So some of the more elite free people of color who may have been born enslaved often build alliances with other elite free people of color who were either freeborn or born enslaved. George Washington Paul, whose picture was featured at the beginning of the presentation, is another example of a free person of color whose family I discuss. I primarily focus actually on his mother, Kitty Paul, who was from the part of Orange County that would become Alamance County. And so in exploring her family, I talk about the fact that her mother was a white woman and she was raised in the single parent household with her white mother. And so that's something that we often don't think about when we think about free people of color, is that some free people of color, their closest interactions are with people who don't share the same status with them. And so I highlight that in this particular section. Now, moving away from the topic of family, I come back to these divisions amongst free people of color around class and gender in a chapter that looks at that topic specifically in the early national period. So say the late 1700s going into the 1850s. And in that section, I'm able to expand a little bit more in my investigation on the divisions of free people of color around these hierarchies of class and gender, because there's just simply more evidence of the divisions in the post-revolutionary period. So my investigation there goes a little bit deeper than just looking at the law, but also looks at the everyday experiences of people. And so the advertisement that you see on the screen is for the return of a free person of color named Marianne Bowen. And so Bowen had been placed into an apprenticeship with a man in her community, and her mother tried to take her away from that man and gain control over her child. And so this is something that is commonplace in the colonial period, but also the national period, where free women of color, especially those who are considered single, have limited rights over their children, and they have to often look at moving against the law and the interests of the masters of their children in order to assert some type of power over their own children. The courts often look out for these families as far as trying to take note of them, and they will find women who have had children out of wedlock and bind their children to masters, therefore preventing these women from building wealth through the labor of their children. And that causes often multiple generations of poverty for families headed by these women. And we can see that it's the local governments and the state ultimately that creates this situation for them. Now, in contrast to the experiences of these poor free people of color, there is a developing class of people that I guess we could say are members of the master class in one way or another. Some of them are slaveholding free people of color. Others are free people of color who keep apprentices or servants under their watch. And so one of these individuals is Donna Montfort, who was a free person of color in Craven County, specifically New Bern. And so he was an artisan and had apprentice workers under him. And we see in the image that's on this slide that he's offering a reward for the return of one of his apprentices who has run away. So the apprentice is another free person of color, yet Donna Montfort, as a person with skills and somebody who is financially successful, is able to have certain powers and privileges over John Turner, who's the person mentioned in the advertisement. And we see how in this particular situation where class is very important in the lives of free people of color, Montfort wouldn't have the power that he had if he wasn't fairly well-to-do, didn't have a certain position in the community. And of course, Turner wouldn't be necessarily under the power of Montfort had he come from a family maybe that either had a head of household that could have taught him a certain skill, or a family that was wealthier and could have sent him to school or something of that nature. Another example of one of these well-to-do free people of color in North Carolina, and specifically again Craven County, New Bern area, is John C. Stanley. And so other historians have written about Stanley, but I decided to dig a little bit deeper into his history and try to find out how he fits into the larger picture of free people of color. And so what you see in the image here is an obituary for John C. Stanley, which a free person of color having an obituary in a newspaper in the early 1800s is pretty unusual, especially in North Carolina. And to see him described in the way that he's described is probably also unusual, especially in the context of a newspaper, maybe not so much in regular discussion, but definitely having a free person of color just being described as having an intellect of the first order in a newspaper is uncommon. But Stanley was an unusual person. He was very well to do. He owned a barbershop business. He was also a planter and enslaved dozens of people to keep his plantations operating, and also his barbershop operating. He used the slave labor for that as well. And he was able to obtain enough wealth to send his children to school. They were very well educated. One of his sons was actually a teacher. So in that sense, if we think back to the Bowen example and the situation of that family, Stanley was able to do much more than they were, even though both the Bowens and Stanley are classified as free people of color. John Patterson Sampson is another individual connected to one of these more well-to-do free people of color families. Sampson's father, James D. Sampson, was an artisan in Wilmington, North Carolina. And because of his connection to his father and his father's success, he was able to obtain a privilege that was rare for many people in North Carolina, whether they were free people of color or not, and that was the opportunity to go to college. Now, John Patterson Sampson was not able to go to college in the state of North Carolina because he could not be admitted into the schools. And so, as a result of that situation, he went to college in Massachusetts. And he had a brother who also attended college in Oberlin, Ohio. Um, but nevertheless, and even though John Patterson Sampson was a person of color and he had to go north to obtain an education, it still says a lot about the status of his family that he was able to obtain that opportunity to get higher education. And he was able to use that education in the post-Civil War years. Now, going past my discussion of free people of color and these class and gender divisions, I examine the situation of free people of color in the North Carolina courts, especially the local courts. And so I examine both the successes that free people of color have in the court. So even though their rights are limited, their ability to testify is limited, we see examples of free people of color who are able to successfully sue white people in court. They're able to defend their rights in court in certain cases. And then also we see free people of color who have to deal with the challenges of everyday life in the court, and I examine that too. So Anderson Mayo is one of those people. I guess you could look at him as facing challenges in the court, but he's also creating challenges in the lives of other people. He, in 1841, is convicted of murder. He had actually murdered his wife, and so he was executed as a result of being convicted of killing his wife, Jessie Mayo. And Anderson Mayo had been in front of the law before for other violent crimes. So we see the justice system working in a different way in his case. He's not necessarily somebody who's suing for to obtain money from somebody or to assert his rights, but instead he's somebody that is being dealt with by the law for committing a crime. And of course, while he's convicted, there are free people of color who are able to put up defenses when they are accused of certain crimes. Now, the final section of my book on North Carolina looks at the situation of free people of color during the Civil War and during the Reconstruction period. So we're looking at basically the 1860s through the early 1880s. And the first half or so of that part of my study focuses primarily on the Civil War, and I discuss the trials and tribulations of free people of color during that time. So free people of color in North Carolina are having to operate under a government that has proclaimed its loyalty to the Confederacy, and that brings certain challenges for them. They're having to find a way to continue to live, to feed themselves, while operating under a government that is committing treason against the United States. And so some of them have to engage in business with people who support the Confederacy, or they're being forced to labor for the Confederacy, digging trenches, things like that. I talked about how certain individuals, of course, push back against the efforts of the rebellion. And some people do that by hiding in the woods or putting up physical resistance, while other people try to escape the grasp of the rebels and move into US held territory. And the United States Army, of course, takes over parts of North Carolina, especially in the east during the war. And so one of the individuals who ends up supporting the United States is Parker D. Robbins, who at the time was living in Bertie County, and he escapes to Virginia, right directly north from where he lives. He joins the U.S. Army, and following his time in the Army, he eventually becomes a member of North Carolina's state legislature. So he uses the expertise that he had learned as a free person of color, both before the Civil War and after the war, to create a space for himself in the political order of the post-Civil War period. Now, while some free people of color in the post-Civil War period are able to use their skills and understanding from the pre-war period to create spaces for themselves politically or in business and other areas, some free people of color face serious challenges from the old guard of North Carolina, those people who had supported slavery, who had supported white supremacy. And one of the famous cases of that is the situation of the people who would have been referred to as the Lowry gang, who were led by Henry Berry Lowry of Robeson County. And so in the image on the screen, you can see two members of the so-called Lowry gang, Thomas Lowry and Calvin Oxendine. And so basically what is happening in this situation is that during the Civil War, the rebels had inflicted a lot of pain and even death on some of the free people of color in Robeson County and the surrounding area, especially those who were resisting impressment into the labor forces of the Confederacy. And so those people who were trying to enforce the supremacy of the Confederacy killed some individuals, including the father of Henry Berry Lowry. And as a result, we start to see from the end of the Civil War into the post-Civil War period, a conflict between these forces that at one point are pro-Confederacy and later become more just clearly white supremacists. A conflict between them and the Lowrys and others and their supporters, who are looking to create a different world in which the white supremacists are not going to dominate the county of Robeson as well as the larger region. And so the discussion of Reconstruction is where I end the book, and that is where I am going to end the talk and look at some of your questions. So if you have questions, feel free to ask them, and I will stop sharing my screen here. Let's see what we've got.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. We've gotten quite a few really interesting questions, but I have to say, first of all, people are so thankful that you are studying this topic, sharing this topic, that this is really something that's coming to the forefront, because we have quite a few people attending tonight who are descendants of free people of color. And so your research really is making an impact.
Great, great. I'm glad to know that there are people in the audience who share that background of being descendants of free people of color, along with everybody else, of course.
And if you'd like, I was looking through and I've compiled a list of some of the questions, and I know we only have a few minutes, but one of the questions we got was, about free people of color interacting with the indigenous peoples on the deerskin trade and how that may have blurred lines as to what a free person of color meant?
That's a tricky question. As far as your is that make clear connections between the indigenous people who are participating in the deerskin trade and the free people of color. And part of the problem is just the quality of records. There could definitely be those connections, but I haven't seen anything specific pointing to that. If someone knows about it, feel free to let me know. But yeah, I can't really add any insight there.
And here's sort of a broad question. How did a lot of these people of color become free?
Yeah, so again, some of them are born free because they have free mothers, free grandmothers. So your freedom's traced through your mother's line. But also they're free people who are becoming free through the process of manumission. So manumission is a legal process in which an enslaved person can become free, and you can become free either maybe by buying your freedom person or so-called meritorious service. So that's something that North Carolina law requires, is that you perform quote unquote meritorious service. Now, what that means and how that's enforced vary a bit. Some people will petition for freedom, or the person who's enslaving them will petition for their freedom and say, oh, well, this person took care of my family member on that family member's deathbed or something of that nature. But then there are other cases where it's not very clear. Sometimes it's quite obvious that the person hasn't actually performed anything that someone would consider meritorious, and they are granted their freedom anyways. So it varies a lot. Some people who are well connected, who are interested in freeing somebody, they are able to get that done regardless of what the law says. If they have the right connections, whether it's with the General Assembly or with the local courts, they can make certain things happen.
Was there ever, and I'm going to try and connect two questions here. Somebody had a question about these judges that really stood up for free people of color, and how should we understand that mindset there? And also connected with that, was there really ever a golden time for free people of color where they did have a lot of support, where they were thriving communities?
Yeah, so as far as judges are concerned, the situation's very messy, because sometimes it seems pretty clear that the judges are not necessarily going to side with a free person of color purely because they like free people of color and see them as equal. That's not necessarily what's going on there. But they want to keep some semblance of order of the law actually mattering, keeping the community in a certain order is important to them, and so enforcing the law is key to that. And if that happens to help a free person of color, sometimes that they're interested in doing that. And one particular example that I can think of is that there is a Supreme Court justice who's well known for his discriminatory actions on the Supreme Court, but then at the same time is advocating on the behalf of a free person of color who was almost murdered by a gang of white people in Raleigh. And it's being done because he doesn't want the gang of white people in Raleigh creating disruption in the community, not necessarily because he is an advocate of free people of color and their rights. So that's what's going on there. And then as far as the golden age for free people of color, that's really hard. I mean, I think that again, we have to to ask the question of who we're talking about when we're thinking about free people of color. Because if you're a poor free person of color, if you're somebody who's in the servant class, I think the situation is always crappy for you, whether you're living in the colonial period or living in the mid 19th century. Now, in the early colonial period, it could be worse maybe than what it was in certain cases, but it varies because again, it depends on who you've been apprenticed to or who you're the servant of. Because a lot of the situation for free people of color is defined by these personal interactions between free people of color and white people who are controlling the law in the state and in the localities.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of these questions don't have a yes or a no.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, that's kind of what I'm doing with this book and the latest book, Beyond Slavery's Shadow, is to try to complicate our understanding of lives of free people of color. And ultimately, my point and my goal is to show that no, it's not a black and white situation, that their lives could vary across the spectrum, and that freedom is not one thing. Being a person of color is not one experience. There are many experiences that are encompassed in those categories.
So I wanted to apologize to people in the chat who are throwing in some fantastic questions. I'm so sorry. I do want to be mindful of everybody's time, and so we do have to bring the program to a close. But we have put your university email into the chat box. These are really, really great questions, and I hope they're able to reach out to you. And I do hope to all of you who have asked questions, I apologize if it didn't get answered, and I hope you can get the answer that you're looking for. And thank you again on behalf of the Orange County Historical Museum, the Alliance for Historic Hillsborough, the Burwell School, for joining us tonight for Beyond Slavery's Shadow. If you enjoyed this program, please check back on our websites for other upcoming programs. And we love being able to offer these programs to the public. So if you would like to support us so that we can continue to do so, you can donate on our pages. And thank you so much, Warren Milteer Jr. This has been really eye-opening and very thought-provoking with some of the things that you were pointing out, especially as you said, it wasn't just free people of color, not free people of color, but the complexity that each of those really carry with it.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for having me. And I wanted to just encourage people again to check out the visitor center and pick up a signed copy of the book. I'm sure a lot of the questions that are in the chat box can be answered by reading one of the books. So I do encourage people to do that, to support what you all have done.
I didn't realize they were signed. There you go.
Yes.
That's even more reason to get one.
Yes, they're signed.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. Thank you to our sponsors. And thank you again to all of you who joined us here tonight, and have a fantastic evening. And don't forget to stop by the Visitor Center and pick up your copy of the book. Thank you. Have a good night.